Hello and very welcome to this evening's seminar, Shifting Geopolitical Realities in the South Caucasus. My name is Martin Krag. I'm the Deputy Head of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our two panelists this evening. It's Stefan Meister, who is also the author of our recent report with the same title as the title of the seminar. Stefan is head of the International Order and Democracy Program at the German Council of Foreign Relations, and he has a long experience as a researcher and working on security and foreign policy issues in the post-Soviet Eastern European region. He is joined by Svante Cornell, who is a well-known expert on the Caucasus and the director of the Institute for Security and Development Policy. And as a short background, why we have a special interest in this topic at the moment is that in September last year, the situation regarding the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh changed dramatically. In a relatively short 44-day war, Azerbaijan was able to re-establish control over territories it had lost in the 1990s. And with the support of Turkey, the Azeri government has changed facts dramatically on the ground. But several issues and problems remain to be solved, and no peaceful solution to the conflict has yet been found. So, Stefan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation, and also thank you for this opportunity to write this paper. As you have said, I have worked a lot on different developments in post-Soviet countries, and I was also the last 2.5 years in the South Caucasus as the head of one of the German political foundations. So I was also on the ground there when the war happened during my period. I will focus on more on the geopolitical picture. So I will also look into the conflict a little bit, but in my short introduction, let's say 10 to 15 minutes, I first of all want to look on how this geopolitical change happened, and also what does it mean also for the EU and for the US from our perspective, and then also naturally for the region. So as you mentioned, more than 1 year after the Second Karabakh War, with 7,000 people around being killed, it is clear that the ceasefire agreement of November the 10th, 2020 has not brought peace to the region. So it's not a peace agreement, it's a ceasefire agreement. And the unresolved status and administration of Karabakh remains one of the disputed issues. The lack of border demarcation between Armenia and Azerbaijan will further fuel tensions between both countries. And the way negotiations are taking place on this issue, with a non-transparent process, military pressure also on Armenia, makes any agreement difficult, and could it even also partly delegitimize in the future. Armenia lost further sovereignty, and its politicians have very, very little room for maneuver in negotiations with Azerbaijan and Russia, but also domestically, because of the defeat and the vulnerability. So they are not good preconditions for a real peace agreement. We saw in mid-November the worst escalation on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border since the end of the war, with several soldiers killed, wounded, and Armenian soldiers caught by the Azerbaijani side. And there are still Armenian prisoners of war on the Azerbaijani side, or catched by the Azerbaijani side. Azerbaijan seems to build up pressure to improve its bargaining position on an agreed corridor on Armenian territory to its exclave Nakhichevan, and border demarcation negotiations. Officially, Russia has nearly 2,000 peacekeepers to secure Karabakh and the Lachin corridor, so the connection between, or the link between Armenia and Karabakh. Unofficially, you can find numbers of military and non-military personnel up to 7,000 to 8,000 people. So it seems to be much bigger than in the initial agreement. This war has shifted the geopolitical situation in the region towards Russia and Turkey. Russia has brokered a ceasefire agreement in circumventing the multilateral OSCE Minsk format, where it also is a co-chair with France and the US. This fits into a trend that Moscow prefers to create new formats where it can dictate the rules and push out also Western partners. I just wanted to remember on the Astana format in the context of Syria. It's also a similar concept, you can say. At the same time, we observe since years a disengagement of the US and European actors in the Karabakh conflict settlement process, which was partly handed over to Russia and which brokered several ceasefires in the last years. So I think that's a process we have already since several years, that there's a kind of handing over to Russia. Even if Russia has supplied weapons to both conflicting parties in the past, without Russian engagement, there would be more escalation in this conflict, you can also argue. A new trend is that third powers are coming increasingly into the South Caucasus and other Eastern European region, and it's especially Turkey and to a limited extent China and Iran who are more active in this region. But I think the focus is on Turkey. Turkey's open support for Azerbaijan was key to the Azerbaijani victory in the war, kind of a game changer besides this new weapons and this military dominance Azerbaijan has developed. Turkey is using its support for Azerbaijan in the Second Karabakh War to increase its leverage on Russia in other regions or on other topics like Syria, Libya, but also the Kurdish question, how it is called. So it's also linking this engagement with other questions where Russia and Turkey might have a different interest or different position. Turkey is challenging Russia also with its weapons supply in Ukraine. So that's another post-Soviet country where we see Turkish drone technique. Israel is selling topical drones and other military technology to Azerbaijan also because of Iran, and increases its cooperation with Azerbaijan on border control and possibly the rebuilding of the retaken region where it was invited also by Baku. So there's also a more comprehensive cooperation, you can say, between Israel and Azerbaijan. I think a key lesson learned is that after a blockade of the Minsk group over years, Azerbaijan has regained territory back and won a war with sophisticated weapons and Turkish support. This is somehow also a negative precedent for peaceful and multilateral conflict solution mechanism, which was dysfunctional over decades because of the blockade by the conflicting parties. So in the end, it brings not a new pattern to this conflict because, yeah, it's the second war, we can say, but I think it undermines also in a way peaceful conflict solution, even if it creates a new reality, which maybe opens new opportunities also for an agreement, let's say like this. Russia has now troops in all three South Caucasus states and increased its leverage on Azerbaijan and also on the other two South Caucasian states. I think the most interesting trend to look in the future are Azerbaijani-Russian relations. Russia has upgraded Azerbaijan's role in formats with Turkey and Iran, but also increased its pressure on the country to join institutions which it has developed to keep the region under control, like Eurasian Economic Union, for instance. Moscow is coming closer to its goal to push the EU and the US out of major regional developments in the region. In parallel, we observe growing activities from the Russian side to integrate Abkhazia, so one of the Georgian conflict zones, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I just want to remember on the memorandum from February 2022 between both sides, which has not been much discussed or recognized. For countries like Georgia, it is the question, who can balance Russia if it's not the US or the EU? And here, I think Turkey is increasingly discussed. Karabakh and Western non-action is also observed, or the Karabakh War is also observed in Tbilisi. So it's also, yeah, for them, this question. Turkey's role in the region will further grow, even if the South Caucasus is not a top priority for Ankara. It is more about leverage on Russia and economic and energy interests with regard to the Caspian Sea, but also to Asia. So it's also about connectivity, further connectivity. At the same time, Turkey provides a non-democratic role model for the South Caucasus countries, and it is currently no bridge anymore into NATO or EU like it was in the past. So what all this means for the West, for the EU and the US? I think the lack of engagement in the Karabakh conflict and the Second Karabakh War has opened room for maneuver for Russia. It has strengthened Russia's role in the region, even if Turkey is now coming in and it's challenging also somehow Russia. Russia's role and the limited action of the West will not help to stabilize the region. Undermining multilateral formats like OSCE Minsk Group and institutions like the OSCE will strengthen authoritarian ways of conflict management. It's not a surprise. The EU and US had already handed over, as I already said in the past, this conflict more or less to Russia. I think which is a major mistake because it also underestimates the importance of this region. Yeah, especially for Europe, I think it is a crucial region. It's a crucial connection also between important geopolitical important areas, also the Middle East and Asia. Russian leadership has no interest to solve conflicts, but to keep and use conflicts as a leverage. And the EU and the US are lacking a comprehensive and long-term strategy for the Black Sea, South Caucasus region. You can say, yes, there is increased NATO military presence in the Black Sea region, but it's not a sufficient reaction also to Russian military build-up. I just want to mention this here. I think it's also important to look broader, yeah, because also from a Russian strategic perspective, this is very crucial also to link Crimea, Black Sea, and the South Caucasus. Turkey is a key player in the region, and with US President Biden, we observe a change in Erdogan's behavior. There's a need to engage with Turkey on military security in the South Caucasus Black Sea region. The idea of a 3+3 format, so the 3 South Caucasian states, Iran, Turkey, and Russia, can further institutionalize these new realities without the West. Even if Georgia and Armenia are skeptical because it would strengthen Russia's position, Turkey, Iran, and Russia will further push for it. Russia, Turkey, and Iran have a common interest to build transit routes and infrastructure through the South Caucasus. This opens certain opportunities for rapprochement of Armenia with Turkey and the possibility of open borders between both countries. In this context, Georgia plays a mediating role in the negotiations between both countries. But still, a precondition for improvement of relations between Ankara and Yerevan remains the normalization of relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And while there is a huge potential for trade and connectivity, and expectations are definitely high here in all the discussions, without a real peace agreement, there also remain many obstacles. There's no security and trust in the region, and I think that's always bad for infrastructure. Every issue in the region, including prisoners of war, infrastructure, borders, have become an instrument of bargaining among the conflict parties. All countries of the South Caucasus should have an interest in more Western engagement because it could increase their leverage towards Russia. But without a serious political and security engagement by the US or the EU, they would become mainly a bargaining chip towards Russia and the other side than being really relevant. So it needs more than just some more meetings, and it needs really more ownership and more responsibility also in the conflict. So that brings me to my recommendations. I just picked up the key recommendations from my paper in a very short, in a relatively short way, focusing on the EU, but then also on the region. So I think my first point is the EU needs to engage more in conflict management, monitoring, and peacekeeping in all the protected conflicts in Eastern Europe. In addition, it's important, it has an important role as a key donor and promoter of dialogue. It needs to become also a relevant actor in establishing and securing peace in the South Caucasus through stronger involvement in multilateral formats. It needs to invest more in various negotiation platforms, including the OSCE, and a possible engagement of the UN. I also understand how difficult this is and how limited the political appetite is in the EU member states about this. My second point is bringing the EU or certain non-partisan states into the conflict mediation and solution process could be an instrument to reanimate OSCE Minsk Group. That's a classical recommendation. France could be replaced by the EU through its special representative, and he could be somehow upgraded also in his role. Third point is the EU is the main donor and an important trading partner for the countries of the region. It has several policies towards the region. But I think the main problem of the EU, not only in this region, but also in this region, is there's a lack of a comprehensive strategy. You have often parallel tracks of policies of the EU, which are not really interlinked with each other. So it needs a comprehensive and integrated approach from the EU for the Black Sea region, for connectivity, Eastern Partnership policy, security engagement, conflict policy, for the Black Sea South Caucasus region, and a coordination here also with the US, better coordination with the US, which has a less an interest and is less willing also to engage in the neighborhood of the EU. Fourth point is the EU needs to start an honest discussion on how to deal with Russia in post-Soviet conflicts, including in the context of Karabakh, and how to better help the people on the ground. So to just hand over conflicts to Moscow and continue non-action will push also Karabakh and Armenia further into Russia's sphere of influence or arms without creating peace and stability in this specific neighborhood of the EU. Regarding past conflict mediation and dialogue projects, we need an honest assessment of what went wrong and what is needed. And the EU and international organizations should focus their attention more on conflict-related challenges as refugees, IDPs, war crime, human rights violations, and housing. My sixth point and last point is local civil society and international organizations should put more efforts into challenging the current adversarial discourses and to put the conflict in the context of human rights protection and non-discrimination policies. All conflict parties should actively work on a deconstruction of threats in their societies, on sending respectful messages to the other party, as well as on confidence building and development of a vision of a common future. More support for democratic development, respect of human rights, and the rule of law in both Azerbaijan and Armenia through Eastern Partnership can have positive effects on both countries. As I said, I'm also aware of that we are pretty far away from this situation, but I don't think that the current situation we have is really, how to say it, will really create the framework for this kind of peace agreement and a more peaceful relations between the conflict parties. And as we see, I think violence is there. It can happen all the time, and it is a very tense and dangerous situation also with this degree of militarization we have in the region. I would stop here, and yeah, I'm happy to hear Svante and also to take questions, and also happy to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, for an excellent introduction. I can mention that as regards questions from the auditorium, these can be directed in two ways, either through the Q&A here in the Zoom application, or as a comment on Facebook, which we will also be able to read. But before we move into that part of the seminar, I would like to give the floor to Svante, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's great to be with you and with Stefan, with whom we have been discussing various issues related to the Caucasus and beyond for many years. There are a couple of problems. First is that the geopolitics of the Caucasus is very close to my heart, so I probably speak too much, in which case you will have to stop me. But I will first like to congratulate the Center for commissioning this study and focusing on this very issue of the geopolitics of the Caucasus, because this issue has tended to be forgotten by people in the West, particularly in Europe, in favor of issues perhaps of a more normative nature. The key, of course, is it hasn't been forgotten by the people in the Caucasus and surrounding the Caucasus, and I think we're learning as often this the hard way by witnessing military violence. Another problem is that I found very little to disagree with in Stefan's paper. There may be minor quibbles, but they're not really worthy of our time today. I will emphasize some of the areas of agreement, but perhaps also go out on a limb on some of the implications of the situation in order to trigger some type of discussion. Now, I shouldn't really need to, don't need to repeat some of the elements in Stefan's analysis, but I think a couple of them are very central. That the war last year was not an end to the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but a new phase. The lack of EU and US engagement in conflict resolution, I think this is my interpretation, perhaps Stefan would dispute it, but I think it formed a permissive environment for a military solution to the conflict. It opened the door for a further Russian consolidation of a domination of the peace process between the two countries, and perhaps inadvertently for the entry of Turkey into the conflict in the region in a major way. I think I would agree with what Stefan says, that the overlay of geopolitical forces and its authoritarian powers is not going to resolve the issue, in spite of proposals like the 3+3 format and so on. And I think the need for greater EU engagement is certainly very much there, but I also seem to agree that this is not a very likely position at this time. I'd like to add to this perhaps by adding in a few words on some of the major actors. I think part of the reasons why this conflict was, or this war was not foreseen was two rapid developments. I think one was the change of political course in Armenia, and another was Turkey's entry into the conflict. Stefan's papers is correct that Armenia missed a number of chances to get a much better deal than what it ended up having with this war. But it seems that Armenia appeared to be a prisoner of its own rhetoric, did not believe that Azerbaijan would start or successfully start a war, or that it even could fight. I remember former President Kocharyan once saying, as Azerbaijan was developing its oil resources, "Do you think the rich man can fight better?" Well, it turned out that this Armenian perception ended up costing them very dearly. Now, I think it is important to note that Prime Minister Pashinyan did initially attempt to take a conciliatory stance and find a negotiated way forward. But as Stefan mentions, he turned very rapidly towards a nationalist policy when he saw the lay of the land. And I think it is partly the lay of the land domestically in Armenia, but also a very peculiar coalition that formed against him, a coalition that consisted of the Armenian forces in Nagorno-Karabakh, his main domestic rival, former President Kocharyan, and some important hardliners in Moscow, who all, for their very different reasons, used this nationalist card in order to try to undermine Mr. Pashinyan. And this forced him, if you will, to be more Catholic than the Pope in terms of the conflict with Azerbaijan. And that in turn, I would say, to a very significant extent, triggered the military reaction from Azerbaijan, which was planned in any case, but I think the timing of it was very much related to this. And I think this questions some of our assumptions in Europe. As Stefan mentions, Armenia was seen as a role model as a member of both the Eurasian Union and with a comprehensive agreement with the EU. But I think that's exactly the problem. Both in Armenia and in Europe, there was a thought that it was feasible for a country that was under a Russian security umbrella to be engaging in a process of democratization and joining European institutions. And this is after what had happened to Georgia, what had happened to Ukraine, and what had happened to Moldova, which begs the question, what were people smoking to think that this would be possible? And I think this was a collective failure on the part of a lot of people in the West. And I think this is a major reason why Russia allowed Armenia to experience this defeat. Plus, of course, the fact that Armenia remained totally dependent on Russia in spite of any kind of agreement it had with the European Union. Another important implication, rather, of this war that we have to put in a regional context is I would say, the differentiation between states in Central Asia and the Caucasus. There are states that are more functioning, able to act on the international scene, and there are others who are not. And I think there's a big contrast here between Armenia and Azerbaijan. What we saw in the past decade was Armenia continuing to have significant issues domestically and internationally, whereas Azerbaijan rose to the level of a mid-sized power. The contrast is, in terms of foreign policy, very stark. President Aliyev didn't have an easy decade. We can go through all the things that happened from the Georgia War, the Arab Spring, which exposed how America was dropping authoritarian allies around the world, to Crimea, to financial crisis in 2014 that almost destroyed the Azerbaijani economy, and so on and so forth. But I think it's important to note how they acted proactively by trying to find a way to deal with Russia without giving up their independence towards Russia, building relations with Israel, and particularly managing to pull in Turkey. We should remember that only 10 or 11 years ago, Turkey was ready to dump Azerbaijan for the protocols that would have normalized relations with Armenia. What a change we have. But what we're seeing, again, I think should be seen in a broader regional context with a big gap emerging. And we have not seen this gap emerging because we have been looking at different things, especially in Europe. We've been focused on helping the so-called more democratic states as a part of the quote unquote more for more strategy that I would argue entirely ignored strategic and geopolitical realities for our own normative concerns that did not mirror and were not based on the geopolitical realities that leaders in all of these countries faced, which undermined very much the countries we were trying to help inadvertently. I would say that there are in this region 3 states, at least, that are emerging as mid-sized power. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan are 3 of these. They are authoritarian, but are engaging in a form of authoritarian modernization reform process, which intends to make the state more effective, to reduce their vulnerability to external influence, to maximize as much as they can popular legitimacy without relinquishing political control. This is a totally different model than the one we are advocating in places like Georgia, Moldova, or Ukraine. The thing, of course, is that these states, by maintaining this political control, can act with a certain level of confidence on the international scene. They're able to engage great powers, not quite as equals, but at least as a somebody, not as a nobody, so to speak. The other side of the coin are states that are very weak internally, that are supplicants in relationship to one or another great power. They are acted upon rather than acting in their neighborhood. They're vulnerable to outside interference. There are obvious examples in Central Asia like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, but I think what's clear is that in the Caucasus, both Armenia and Georgia fall into this category. I'm afraid Moldova does too, and in spite of its size, I think the same can be said for Ukraine in many ways. The point here is not to, so to speak, say that we should all embrace an authoritarian modernization model and forget about spreading, European values and democratic governance across our, quote unquote, near abroad. The point I'm trying to make that the strategy through which we tried to help liberalizing states failed because we disregarded security and geopolitics, and that meant that we were not placing ourselves in a position to support and strengthen the security of these states, and that in turn allowed Russia and others to undermine them from within. And therefore we see that the states that we have been, so to speak, putting our eggs in that basket have not fared very well. I think Georgia is the most important example right now, whereas others have been doing much better. Of course, they have natural resources, they have other things, but this is a bigger discussion. In the interest of time, I throw this out for our discussion. I'd like to just contextualize the idea also of Russia as a winner in this conflict. I don't dispute that there is certainly a very strong case to be made for this, for Russia achieving a military presence in all 3 countries in the Caucasus that it never had, at least for a very long time. But I would ask, so to speak, just again, as a devil's advocate, I'd like to ask the following question. Did the conflict really go according to Russia's desire or Russia's plans? And I would say no. Russia did not control the escalation process in this conflict, which I think is very important and which departs from the way Russia would like to have things in conflicts in the Caucasus or in Eastern Europe. Russia did not have the initiative, and we saw before the war that Russia saw this danger, especially in Armenia's increasingly irredentist and revisionist policies, and Lavrov very strongly warned Armenia in this regard several times. in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Russian role was always, or let me put it this way, Russia's biggest leverage on Azerbaijan was always its ability to interfere in with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and at some point to favor a solution that would be acceptable to Baku. Russia no longer has that leverage. This leverage is now reduced to the issue of the corridor and the use of its military bases that it now has in Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm not sure this is better than what that Russia had before. But I think the key thing is that Moscow did not gain influence anywhere with one exception. In Azerbaijan, you see people waving Turkish flag, Israeli flags, Pakistani flags. You don't see anybody waving Russian flags. In spite of the fact that Russia tolerated this Azerbaijani victory, they gained basically no goodwill in Azerbaijan, which I think is a fairly important point. In Armenia, of course, it goes without saying that Russia lost tremendous amounts of goodwill, and there's a feeling of utter betrayal in Armenia with regard to Russia. The only exception is the remaining territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is becoming, as I'm paraphrasing Stefan's paper, that it's a South Ossetia, effectively, a place with a small population, totally dependent on Russian military presence, and with a passportization process taking place as well. In effect, you could say that one of the major effects of this conflict is the separation of Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia. Armenia has gone further away from Russia as much as it can, but at least mentally, I think there is no question it has. Whereas Nagorno-Karabakh has become even more dependent on Russia than it ever was. Not to Armenia, but to Russia. Now, to be very provocative, I would say you could read Russia's intervention in a series of conflicts the following way. In 2008, Russia wanted Georgia, but it lost Georgia. Instead, it won South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In 2014, Russia would have liked to have Ukraine, but it lost Ukraine. It gained Crimea and the Donbass as a kind of a consolation prize. And in 2020, it lost Armenia and gained Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm being very provocative. I know it might not at all be turning out this way. It's too soon to say, but I think it's important to keep in mind that this is one way of looking at it. It might not be the right way of looking at it. I don't want to take too much time, so let me just say a few words about Turkey and then close. I am absolutely in agreement with Stefan that Turkey's entry into the Caucasus in this fashion is the major development, I would say. It's the biggest shift, the biggest change, much bigger than anything that happened with Russia, even bigger than what happened with the irrelevance of the West in this conflict. And I think Stefan correctly links it to the growing Turkish role in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. We could go further into the Middle East, where Turkish and Russian interests have clashed in a number of theaters, as they would like to call it. Now, this is a bigger discussion, but I think we have to at least throw it out there, which is, what does this mean for our relationship with Turkey from a European perspective? Now, anybody who follows the work of our institute and myself knows that I have been a stronger critic of President Erdogan from at least for 15 years. Before it was cool to be against Erdogan, I was against Erdogan. But I think now we have to ask ourselves, in view of the declining US role in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, if Turkey is now not emerging as the major counterforce to Russian influence in terms of a security, geopolitical, and even military perspective. If this is the case, what does this mean for Europe's own strategic planning and for Europe's relationship with Turkey? We have seen a lot of people in Eastern Europe beginning to change their perceptions and seeing the world this way. In Ukraine, this is definitely happening. This is happening in Poland as well. Of course, it is difficult for us to engage in this type of thinking precisely for the same reason that I argued before, that we don't like to think this way. We like to think that we have a problem with Turkey because of the way Turkey is behaving domestically, and even the way it is treating Europe sometimes. And I am absolutely in agreement with this. But I think we have to find a way, at least to discuss whether we need to compartmentalize this issue and look at the same time from a purely security point of view at the role that Turkey is playing in Eastern Europe, because we may have no choice. Given what is happening in Moscow, what we are seeing happen with Russia on the Ukrainian border, and the broader implications of Russia's challenge to the European security system, how much do we need to coordinate with Turkey? How much do we need to view our relationship with Turkey jointly, with Russia jointly with how we construct a form of relationship with Turkey that has nothing to do with EU membership, but that is of a more security and a more strategic nature. Last word. I think that the key question is what kind of security environment we're dealing with. And I think the war that we saw last year was an example of decline of the European security order in certain ways, or the order that the EU would have liked to have, the norms-based, the rules-based international order in the EU's neighborhood. The EU has said so many times, European politicians have said, there is no military solution to the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. They said this, they said this, they said this, that didn't make it any true. We have seen that a lot of powers, usually larger powers, the Russians, the Turks, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Saudis, and others have been showing that they do believe there is a military solution to conflicts. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they actually create more problems than they resolve, even for themselves. But I think the Azerbaijanis and the Turks very much saw that the world had changed. There was now very much a feasible military solution, and I think others are going to pick up from this experience and draw the similar conclusions. We're now dealing with a different security architecture, a different security environment. And I think there is no way that we can ignore this anymore. We need to accept that there is a very hard geopolitical reality in areas very close to the European Union, on the southern boundary in North Africa, on the eastern boundary in the Eastern Partnership countries. And all of this directly affects the EU. And we now have to adapt to deal with this reality and become a geopolitical actor in a way that the EU, for natural reasons, does not want to do. I will only say that in the South Caucasus, it seems to me that the most obvious way of doing this is to suggest that, well, if you're going to do a 3x3+3, it should be a 4+3. The EU has strong enough assets in this region that it should have a seat at the table. Let me close here. I hope I didn't take too much time from the discussion.
No, not at all. Thank you, Svante, for excellent reflections and comments. Stefan, would you like to just shortly maybe react to some of the comments you got?
Yeah, I think it was really good addition also to what I have said, and maybe also even bring it in a broader frame. And I think we do not disagree with each other, but I also want to maybe point out several things. I think it's really a very important point to understand that the focus on more for more, as you also said it from the EU side, and on democratization, transformation of states, and somehow the ignorance of geopolitical developments and also other models of governance and of state reforms, I think, has created a situation where the EU policy relies on relatively weak states. Yeah, so in a way that I think Georgia was the key country in terms of reforms, and it's now backsliding because of the weakness also of the EU, because of the security situation we have, the lack also of attractiveness of the EU as a transformative model, and the withdrawal of the US from the region. So I think it's also the nature of EU policy and its absence in key sectors creates this kind of limited reform and transformation. So there's, yeah, I think that's a problem. And I think Moldova, we are all very happy about what happened in Moldova, but we see a very fragile state. So with weak institutions, and I think that's a long-term game. I would be rather less skeptical about Ukraine. I think we have a very strong civil society there, but I also understand that this is a very, very long game, and there's a lot to spoiler also from other actors. So then I just wanted to react. I think I agree also with you. It's not an argument I use very much here in this article, but I also have a strong background on Russia policy. So we have the post-Soviet region is ending somehow. Yeah, I think we still use here a term we should not use, because I think it's getting much more diverse and much more regional. So we will have different regional orders in different parts of this post-Soviet region, where third powers, and I mentioned also a little bit China and other players, but yeah, if we talk about Central Asia, that's another game, yeah, where Russia is losing its influence. And it's not only the lack of soft power, but it's also the way how it behaves towards these countries. So it's alienating also these countries in a way, and the only leftover of Russian influence is the military power. So you have to go in the end into these militarily into the region, and I think and the way Russia also is doing this, I think, is further alienating also societies who are transforming. Yeah. And I think this is also what we can see in the South Caucasus. And here I would agree with you. I think in the end, Russia is left with some small entities to keep these countries under control. And it has to bargain more with other players, but also small countries have quite a leverage sometimes. I think Belarus was an example until 2020, how much you can get from Russia. And maybe just as a final point, I don't want to repeat, I think we are in a different game now with Russia. Also as the European Union and as the US, I think there is a different paradigm also in this multipolar world where the US is withdrawn from different regions and the EU is not able to fill this gap. And other players, including Russia, are shaping the neighborhood of the EU. And we let's say we less and less in a way, because we are not recognizing these geopolitical changes which are going on there. And we don't have the toolbox also and the political will to do the things which are necessary to stabilize our neighborhood. So it's a lot about security, and security in a very broad sense. So it's not only about hard security. There are different layers also of security. And I think the EU should have the mindset and also the toolbox for many of these areas. But I think this lack also of political will is creating this gap, and I think that's really problematic. And I think we can see this, so we can analyze this very well in the South Caucasus at the moment. So thanks. I stop here.
Thank you. We have a number of questions that we received via Facebook and in the Q&A. And we will try to circle back to most of them as time allows. One question regards the role of Russian peacekeepers. Maybe Stefan, if you can bring just the facts that you have from the top of your mind, in the region, the broader balance. There was also a question regarding, Russian military assets in Armenia, like in the Gyumri military base. What is the military balance there in the region as a whole regarding, for example, Russia? What is the military presence of Turkey? Maybe if you could also make some comparative remarks regarding let's call it the hard facts on the ground. Would you like to
directly react, or you want to?
You want some time to reflect, or should I?
No. I think
okay.
Maybe Svante can also add, because I'm not so much an expert on Turkey and on the Turkish presence.
And Svante, of course, feel free to fill in. But maybe if you want to start, Stefan.
So I mentioned this officially nearly 2,000 peacekeepers, and I also mentioned a different number which you can find in different sources which are not really officially, but you talk about up to 7,000 military and non-military personnel. I cannot really prove this, but these are numbers I just could find in different publications. I think you have around 3,000 troops in Gyumri, which is more about also Turkey and Iran. So you have here disciplinary personnel, but I think you should also not underestimate Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which I think has much more troops. What I remember, I think how much it was, 5,000, 5,500, maybe even more. So, and I think South Ossetia, if you see South Ossetia, it's very important also, like Crimea, in this military build-up of Russia in the Black Sea region towards Turkey and towards the Middle East, and also the supply, for instance, of Donbass is partly going through South Ossetia. So it plays here also a role. Yeah, so I think it's part of a bigger game. So it's not only about the South Caucasus and to keep this region under control, but this is a transit region or an access region to other regions, yeah, to the Middle East in particular, and also to this goal of controlling the Black Sea region, then to protect power beyond this region, yeah. So and I think that. So it's partly about Armenia, yeah, and also the conflict regions, but it's in its mass. I think it's much more beyond this. But about Turkey, I'm not sure. So I would rather hand over to Svante if he has the numbers. Or...
The short answer is no, because for those of us who've studied the Caucasus and in particular Azerbaijan, or for that matter, the Turkish military, these are black boxes. It's extremely difficult to get any kind of real information. My sense is that the Turkish military presence is very different from the Russian one. The Russians move in and build a base. The Turkish connection to the Azerbaijani military, as far as I understand it, and I don't understand it very well, is that it's very organic. The Turkish influence is everywhere in the Azerbaijani military. It's not in one place or another place. These two institutions are very tightly interlinked in a way that makes the Turkish influence very real, but also extremely difficult to pinpoint. That's as much as I would say. Now, during the war, we saw for the first time a situation where the Turks basically parked a bunch of F-16s in a military base in Ganja in northwestern Azerbaijan. And President Aliyev made it very clear that these did not leave the base in spite of being there for an exercise before the war. For all I know, they might still be there. I think there is so what I'm trying to say is that there's been a gradual increase over probably 20 years and accelerating in the past 5 years of a Turkish military presence in Azerbaijan, and it's one that I think is only going to continue, because this is not a relationship that's led on the Turkish side necessarily from President Erdogan himself. This is very much one that is led by the institutions of Turkey, the intelligence and security institutions that have more and more taken charge of foreign and security policy in the past 5 years.
Yeah, interesting. We have a question also from Per of a question of a different nature. It regards the historical buildings where, for example, Armenian churches and in the territories that were now overtaken by Azerbaijan last year. What is the status of these particular places and the people who, what is the situation also for the people who, Armenians who have remained there? If you could maybe just give us a short description of the situation on the ground. Stefan, would you like to begin?
Yes, so I haven't been on the ground, yeah, I have to say, so I don't know what is exactly the situation on the ground, but what I have heard and seen is that the people just left these territories, yeah. So I think we don't have really people left over in the territories reconquer also by the Azerbaijani side. So we know that some of the historical buildings have been destroyed. And there was a discussion to bring in also UNESCO institutions or representatives also to somehow to realize what is there and how to protect also these buildings. But I think there's a policy also, a history policy, yeah, is going on about who has roots also in these territories, who owns these territories historically, and also somehow rewriting history. Yeah, so and I think that's so that means that this also the buildings and who have built these buildings and who was first there, I think is part also of this kind of information war conflict. Yeah, I think from both sides, and I think that's why they are really in the center also of the discussion. And I think I would be very concerned about, yeah, what what can be destroyed and what will be further destroyed also on these territories. I think we had the same also on the Armenian side. Yeah, I think there were also cemeteries, this destroyed. But nevertheless, I think that's a major issue. Here's a lot of also humankind heritage. Yeah, I think in this region, which belongs maybe to the mankind, you can say it. Yeah, so in terms of history and who settled in this area, and I think that needs more attention also, how to protect these buildings. Yeah. Great.
Here's a question that is perhaps directed for both of you, but maybe Svante would like to give it a try first. Because it's mentioned in the comment, you know, Svante's reflections, your reflections on the Western focus on, for example, normative issues, rule of law, international law, etc. And the question regards the territorial sort of legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh region. And that it was not recognized as Armenian territory, as mentioned by Stefan in his report. Even Armenia also didn't recognize it or officially declare it Armenian territory. But it was also an issue that was perhaps not brought up a lot in relationship to Armenia by the EU, for example, in the past. What is your take on this? Is there any way that this normative aspect could have been discussed in a different way? Could have that led to different results regarding the conflict resolution between Armenia and Azerbaijan if the Western states or Russia had taken a different approach, for example, already 20 years ago?
Well, this is a big question. I mean, I'm sure those of you who have traveled to, for example, Baku would have very frequently heard that, well, you know, there are some issues of human rights and rule of law that you care very much about. And there are others like international law and the rights of our refugees that you don't care about. So what is your claim to be some kind of great humanitarian? You know, this was the discussion, this was the point of view from the Azerbaijani side, that there was very much a double standard on the Western side, that we cared about some things but not about others. I think more important, and I think one of the reasons why the Azerbaijani leadership concluded that they were or decided to engage in military action is that they began to see a dichotomy. They began to see a dichotomy, and I think Crimea was a key dividing moment. Before that, they had seen, you know, we cared a little more about Moldova's territorial integrity and about Georgia's territorial integrity. For example, if you look at the EU association agreements with these countries, it's very clear. The language in the case of Moldova and Georgia is identical, but it doesn't have the same support for ironclad support for territorial integrity as it does in the case of Azerbaijan. And of course, the reason was that we also wanted a similar deal with Armenia, and those were linked with each other. But the reality was there, and that was very damaging. What happened with Crimea, of course, is that the Crimean case was so much more similar to the Nagorno-Karabakh case in terms of how a territory was taken by another, basically, by another state from the Azerbaijani perspective. And they saw that, well, the EU and the West seems to care very much about Ukraine's territorial integrity, and they don't seem to care about our territorial integrity. And they saw that there was a sliding of the principle of territorial integrity. And therefore, they decided that we can't trust these systems. We can't trust the OSCE Minsk group. If we're going to solve this, we're going to have to take it into our own hands. I mean, like it or not, but I think this is the thought process that was going on in Baku. And I think there were mistakes made by the Western powers that made it easier for the Azerbaijanis to draw this conclusion and to lose the authority that was needed to keep these two powers at the negotiating table.
Stefan, would you like to comment also on this issue? Or
So I agree. I can just add, I think it is important to have a normative approach. So I'm also supporting a normative approach, yeah, in a way that I think we need a kind of rule-based order. We need also support rule of law, and I still believe that only societies who have these kind of normatives, I think they are able also to find peace in a way, yeah. So, but I think the main point here is the inconsequence. I think that this is what also what Svante mentioned. So is how you decide in this conflict and in the other conflict, yeah. Why Ukraine seems to be more important than maybe yeah, Karabakh, or there was more support also with this regard, yeah. So, and I think you can criticize Azerbaijan as an authoritarian state with human rights problems, and I think in terms of some question of international law, they have a point, yeah. So, and I think that's then also the question how. So, and I see also the conflict here which we have, but I think. You can feel sometimes that there are double standards, there are other interests, there are other priorities, and I think this inconsequence also of the own normative approach undermines, as you also said, I think the credibility, yeah. So, and I think that creates open. So I think that creates also for actors like Russia, yeah, opportunities also to explore. Yeah, and to send out these messages, yeah. So in terms of who is here consequent in this regard, yeah. So, and I think. Yeah, that's a big challenge I think we face also inside of the EU, yeah, at the moment. So with rule of law, and I think that's also discussed in countries like Georgia, yeah, what happens in Hungary and Poland, and how long EU did not react, or member states did not react to this situation there.
Thanks. We have a detailed question from an old colleague of mine, Ingmar Oldberg, who has a pointed question about the transit, Azeri transit through southern Armenia, and what is the status of this and the sort of Azeri enclave in the southern part of Armenia? Maybe you also, if you would like to give it a go, maybe both of you. Yeah, Stefan, would you like to? Yeah, sure.
I can just. So I don't. Yeah, I can just. So I think in the ceasefire agreement, there is agreed that there will be a corridor through the SCEEUS region on the southern border to Iran, to Nakhchivan. So this is, we're talking about Nakhchivan, and this will be controlled by FSB border troops. Yeah. So, and I think that's the agreement. This has not happened until now. So there is no agreement that this corridor is built, or this connection is built. And I think parts of this aggression we could observe in November is also about putting pressure on Armenia to agree on this interconnector. Yeah. So, and I think there's also a Turkish interest then to use this corridor towards Azerbaijan and further to the Caspian Sea. So there is more than an Azerbaijani interest, but at the moment, I think for Pashinyan, it's very difficult to agree on anything. I think he's domestically so much under pressure also to sign a further agreement, which is not in the benefit of Armenia, and even undermines further also its sovereignty. It creates problems also with the access to Iran, yeah, possibly, which is somehow an ally also of Armenia, and yeah, so that's why I think it has not been created until now.
I could only add that I think this is one of the big unknowns. When I was skeptical about this from day one, because it's very vaguely formulated in the agreement, and that brought me back to the Key West negotiations 20 years ago, where this was the exact issue that led to an agreement. Well, there are probably more issues, but one of the main issues why an agreement was not reached, even a preliminary one in Key West, was that the two sides had completely different ideas of what a corridor would be. the Azerbaijanis talked in terms of territorial control, and the Armenians basically thought, well, you know, an elevated highway would be good enough, right? To make a long story short. And I think we have exactly the same situation today. And I have been a little bit surprised that in Azerbaijan, there seems to be a total, you know, a sense of security that this corridor is going to happen. And when I ask people, you know, why are you so sure it's going to happen? They say, well, you know, President Putin's signature on it, and therefore he will make sure it happens. And I'm like, well, you know, are you really sure that that's good enough, that's a strong enough argument for that to happen in the future? And I'm not sure. And I think everybody with a sense of geopolitical history would understand that Russia doesn't have any particular desire for the reconnection of the Turkic world, even if it's by the means of a small corridor through Armenia from Nakhchivan to Turkey, to Azerbaijan. And I think the Russians are perfectly happy slow walking this issue. I think the Iranians are actively opposing this corridor with everything they have at their disposal, which is more than we might think. And I think the Armenians, as Stefan very correctly pointed out, have really no interest in this happening, see it as a further undermining of their sovereignty and something that could create very serious domestic disturbances. Problem is, again, it is in the agreement. And I think one of the big reasons why there is so much military activity in the vicinity of this area is that the Azerbaijanis are realizing that this may not be going the way they want it to, and they want to pressure Armenia into making concessions on this issue. It may be actually counterproductive the way they're going about it. I'm not sure, but I think this issue is potentially one that could lead to much more serious escalation in the future.
The last question from Heinz Ragren was, you know, what are the long-term possibilities for a peaceful solution? But I think Svante gave, you know, a very good answer to that question, perhaps at least in the medium term, because we are running out of time. The topic is very fascinating. It's interesting, and it's crucial also in terms of a broader European security perspective. If you haven't had the time yet to download and read Stefan's paper on our website, please do so. Also, of course, everything Svante has written, you know, most of it, I guess, is available at the website of ISDP. It's a highly recommended reading. And to both of you, thank you a lot for your participation, and hope that we can re-engage soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.